The Jewish assertion of being the chosen people, as articulated in Deuteronomy 7 verse 6, presents a bold theological claim that positions Jews as uniquely selected by God above all nations, inviting rigorous scrutiny for its implications of divine favoritism. Rooted in a 3,300-year biblical timeline spanning from Adam to Jesus, set across the ancient landscapes of Mesopotamia, Canaan, and Egypt, this concept hinges on an exclusive covenant that critics argue fosters elitism and justifies cultural separatism. The term chosen people, explicitly introduced in the Torah, designates the Israelites as God's elect, tasked with upholding His law as a holy nation. However, its historical development through periods of exile and its persistence into modernity raise critical questions about its legitimacy and broader consequences. Does this claim reflect a divine mandate, or is it a self-serving construct designed to assert superiority in a volatile ancient world surrounded by powerful empires? The survival of Jewish identity, particularly through the tribe of Judah, amidst the Assyrian and Babylonian exiles, is often cited as evidence of divine favor, yet critics contend it demonstrates strategic cultural preservation rather than supernatural endorsement, challenging the theological foundation of chosenness. The biblical chronology underpinning this claim begins with Adam around 3,300 BCE, establishing a monotheistic framework in Genesis. The narrative progresses through Noah's survival of the flood around 2,700 BCE, which reinforces God's covenantal relationship with humanity. Abraham's covenant, dated to approximately 2000 to 1800 BCE, marks a pivotal moment, promising land, descendants, and divine blessing in Genesis 12 verses 1 to 3. This covenant, extended to Isaac and Jacob, culminates in the formation of the 12 tribes, with Judah's lineage becoming central to Jewish identity. The Exodus under Moses, occurring around 1526 to 1370 BCE, delivers the Torah, formalizing Israel's role as God's chosen through commandments and rituals outlined in Exodus 19 verses 5 to 6. By the time of Jesus' ministry around 4 BCE, the Jews, primarily descendants of Judah, Benjamin, and Levi, had endured significant historical upheavals, including the Assyrian conquest of 722 BCE and the Babylonian exile from 587 to 539 BC. Unlike other ancient peoples, such as the Hittites or Philistines, who faded into obscurity, the Jews maintained their identity, prompting questions about whether this resilience reflects divine selection or a deliberate cultural strategy. The term chosen people evolved from patriarchal promises to a post-exilic reaffirmation of identity, particularly after the Babylonian exile, when figures like Ezra and Nehemiah reinforced covenantal practices to preserve ethnic and religious distinctiveness. Critics argue this evolution suggests a calculated effort to maintain cohesion in the face of external pressures, rather than a divine mandate. The claim's influence extends beyond Judaism, shaping Christianity's spiritual adoption of the covenant, as seen in Galatians 3 verses 28 to 29, where believers are deemed Abraham's heirs through faith. This adaptation raises further questions about whether the Jewish claim to chosenness holds up under historical scrutiny or serves primarily to legitimize exclusivity, potentially fostering division rather than unity. Archaeological evidence, such as the Merneptah stele from around 1200 BCE, confirms Israel's early presence in Canaan, but it does not substantiate divine election, suggesting the narrative may be a human construct rooted in cultural survival. This essay critically examines the theological origins of the chosen people concept, its historical evolution through exilic and post-exilic periods, the resilience that sustained Jewish identity, and its profound impact on Christianity's development. By grounding the analysis in textual evidence from the Torah and historical records, alongside archaeological findings, the essay questions the divine basis of the Jewish claim, exploring whether it reflects a theological truth or a strategic narrative crafted to ensure survival and influence in a complex ancient world. Part 1. Theological origins of the chosen people claim. The Jewish claim to being the chosen people, as articulated in the Torah, particularly Deuteronomy 7 verse 6, asserts that Israel is a holy people selected by God to obey His commandments, a designation critics argue fosters an elitist self-perception that elevates Jews above other nations. This theological concept, rooted in a biblical timeline beginning with Adam around 3300 BCE, gains prominence through Abraham's covenant in Genesis 12 verses 1-3, dated to approximately 2000 to 1800 BC. This covenant promises land, progeny, and divine blessing, positioning the Israelites as uniquely favored. The promise, reiterated to Isaac and Jacob, evolves into a formalized covenant through Moses' receipt of the Torah around 1526 to 1370 BCE, with Exodus 19 verses 5-6 declaring Israel a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Critics question whether this theological construct reflects a genuine divine mandate or serves as a strategic narrative to unify a nomadic people in a region surrounded by polytheistic neighbors, such as the Canaanites, who worshipped deities like Baal. The explicit term, chosen people, in Deuteronomy suggests an exclusivity that critics contend promotes division rather than universal righteousness, potentially alienating other cultures rather than fostering harmony. The biblical narrative establishes a monotheistic foundation, beginning with Adam's creation around 3300 BCE and continuing through Noah's survival of the flood around 2700 BCE, as described in Genesis. This monotheism starkly contrasts with the polytheistic traditions of Mesopotamia, where gods like Marduk dominated. Abraham's rejection of idolatry in favor of a singular god marks a significant theological shift, but critics argue this shift was less about divine selection and more about distinguishing the Israelites from surrounding cultures. The Torah's legal framework, delivered at Sinai, reinforces this distinctiveness through rituals such as circumcision, Sabbath observance, and dietary laws. Critics view these practices as cultural barriers designed to maintain ethnic cohesion rather than evidence of divine endorsement. For instance, circumcision, mandated in Genesis 17 verses 10-14, physically marked Israelite males, setting them apart from neighboring peoples, which some interpret as a mechanism for social isolation rather than a sacred obligation. Isaiah 42:6's call for Israel to be a light unto the nations suggests a universal mission to spread divine truth, yet the exclusivity embedded in the chosen people concept undermines this ideal. Critics argue that this mission, while aspirational, often manifested as a justification for cultural separatism, as Israel's strict adherence to the Torah distanced it from other nations. Archaeological evidence, such as the Merneptah stele from around 1200 BCE, confirms Israel's presence in Canaan as a distinct group, but it offers no validation of divine chosenness. The stele, erected by an Egyptian pharaoh, mentions Israel's defeat, indicating their existence but not their theological claims. This lack of external corroboration suggests that the chosen people narrative may be a human-crafted identity, constructed to foster unity and resilience in a hostile region. The theological claim, while deeply rooted in sacred texts, invites skepticism about its divine authenticity. Was the designation of Israel as God's chosen a divine directive, or was it a cultural mechanism to ensure survival amidst competing powers like Egypt and Mesopotamia? The Israelites' monotheism, though revolutionary in its context, may reflect a strategic effort to assert cultural superiority rather than supernatural favor. This perspective challenges the notion of chosenness as an objective divine truth, prompting further examination of how this claim evolved historically to sustain Jewish identity through centuries of adversity. The tension between divine election and cultural strategy sets the stage for analyzing its historical development and broader implications. Part 2. Historical evolution of the chosen people concept. The Jewish claim to being the chosen people evolved through a series of historical events, from patriarchal covenants to post-exilic reforms, but critics argue it reflects strategic self-definition rather than divine endorsement. The concept's origins lie in Abraham's covenant, dated around 2000 to 1800 BCE, as recorded in Genesis 12 verses 1-3, which promised progeny, land, and divine blessing. This covenant, extended to Isaac and Jacob, solidified with the formation of the 12 tribes around 1800 to 1700 BCE, with Judah emerging as a central lineage. The Exodus under Moses, occurring around 1526 to 1370 BCE, marked a pivotal moment, as the delivery of the Torah codified the term chosen people in Deuteronomy 7 verse 6, emphasizing Israel's role as God's elect, tasked with upholding his law. The united monarchy under David and Solomon, around 1000 BC, elevated this claim, with the first temple in Jerusalem symbolizing divine presence. Critics, however, question whether this period reflects divine favor or political consolidation, as the temple centralized worship and bolstered national identity under a unified monarchy, potentially serving as a tool for state building rather than a testament to divine selection. The Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom in 722 BC dispersed 10 of the 12 tribes, leaving Judah, Benjamin, and Levi to carry the covenantal identity. This loss of the northern tribes tested the chosen people concept, yet the southern tribes maintained their distinctiveness through adherence to Torah practices. The Babylonian exile from 587 to 539 BCE posed an even greater challenge, as Judah's elites were deported to Babylon. Despite this upheaval, synagogue worship, Torah study, and adherence to rituals like Sabbath observance, as reflected in the prophecies of Ezekiel, preserved Jewish identity. Critics argue this preservation was a cultural strategy to resist assimilation into Babylonian society, not evidence of divine intervention. The return under Ezra around 458 BCE and Nehemiah's rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls further reinforced the chosen people claim, with Ezra's reforms emphasizing strict adherence to the Torah to maintain ethnic purity. Some scholars contend these reforms were less about divine mandate and more about countering the threat of cultural erosion in a Persian-dominated world. The Maccabean revolt around 167 BCE, against Hellenistic pressures under Antiochus IV, further entrenched the chosen people concept. The revolt, chronicled in 1 Maccabees, emphasized Jewish distinctiveness through resistance to Greek cultural imposition, establishing festivals like Hanukkah to commemorate rededication of the Second Temple. The Dead Sea Scrolls, from the 2nd century BC, reaffirm this claim, with texts like the Community Rule highlighting a sect's belief in their covenantal role. Critics, however, view these developments as responses to external threats rather than proof of divine selection, noting that other ancient groups, such as the Persians, also preserved cultural identities without claiming divine chosenness. The Jewish emphasis on textual preservation, through scrolls and later the Hebrew Bible, distinguished them from neighboring cultures, but this codification raises questions about whether it was a deliberate effort to maintain ethnic and religious identity in the face of existential challenges. This historical evolution suggests a calculated effort to sustain a distinct Jewish identity, prompting skepticism about whether chosenness is a theological truth or a survival mechanism. The Jews' ability to codify their claim through texts, rituals, and communal practices, unlike many ancient peoples who assimilated or vanished, underscores their resilience. Yet, this resilience invites critical examination of whether the chosen people concept reflects divine endorsement or a strategic narrative designed to navigate a hostile ancient world, setting the stage for analyzing the mechanisms behind this enduring identity. Part 3. Resilience and the preservation of chosenness. The Jewish claim to being the chosen people endured through centuries of exiles and cultural pressures, but critics argue this resilience reflects human tenacity rather than divine providence. The Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom in 722 BC scattered 10 of the 12 tribes, leaving Judah, Benjamin, and Levi as the covenant's heirs. This loss threatened the chosen people concept, yet the southern tribes preserved their identity through adherence to Torah practices, such as circumcision and Sabbath observance. The Babylonian exile from 587 to 539 BCE posed a more severe challenge, displacing Judah's elites to Babylon. Despite this upheaval, synagogue worship, Torah study, and adherence to dietary laws, as documented in the Book of Daniel, maintained Jewish distinctiveness. These practices, rooted in texts like Leviticus, fostered a portable identity that did not rely on a physical homeland. Critics contend this was a calculated effort to resist assimilation into Babylonian culture, not a divine miracle, as other displaced groups also developed strategies for survival. The return to Jerusalem under Ezra around 458 BCE and Nehemiah's reforms, including the rebuilding of the city's walls, reinforced the chosen people claim. Ezra's emphasis on Torah adherence and prohibition of intermarriage, as recorded in Ezra 9-10, aimed to preserve ethnic and religious purity in a Persian-dominated world. The Second Temple, completed around 516 BCE, became a symbol of the chosen people's role, with festivals like Passover and Sukkot reinforcing communal identity through shared rituals. The books of Chronicles, compiled during this period, meticulously trace Judah's lineage back to Abraham, emphasizing continuity. Modern genetic studies, showing Jewish populations share Levantine origins, corroborate this historical continuity, but critics argue these findings support cultural persistence, not necessarily divine favor. Other ancient groups, such as the Phoenicians, also maintained cultural identities without claiming supernatural selection, suggesting Jewish survival was not unique in its mechanics. The Hellenistic period under Antiochus IV, around 167 BCE, tested Jewish identity through forced Hellenization, including bans on circumcision and Torah study. The Maccabean Revolt, chronicled in 1 Maccabees, preserved Jewish practices by defeating Seleucid forces and rededicating the Second Temple, an event commemorated by Hanukkah. This victory entrenched the chosen people concept, as the Hasmonean dynasty promoted Jewish law as a marker of divine favor. Critics, however, view this as strategic adaptation to external threats, akin to the resilience of other cultures, such as the Persians, who preserved their Zoroastrian identity under Greek and later Islamic pressures. The Dead Sea Scrolls, from the 2nd century BC, reveal communities like the Qumran sect reinforcing their covenantal role, but their isolationist stance suggests a defensive posture rather than divine endorsement. The persistence of the chosen people claim, while remarkable, invites scrutiny about its divine legitimacy. The Jews' ability to maintain their identity through exiles, reforms, and revolts demonstrates extraordinary cultural tenacity, but critics argue this mirrors the survival strategies of other ancient peoples who did not claim divine chosenness. The emphasis on rituals, texts, and communal practices may have fostered isolation, as the chosen people concept set Jews apart from neighboring cultures, potentially limiting broader integration. This isolation raises questions about whether the claim's primary function was to motivate resistance against assimilation or to assert a theological truth. The resilience of Jewish identity, while influential in shaping religious history, necessitates further examination of its broader impact, particularly its role in the development of Christianity, which adapted the covenantal framework to a universal context. Part 4. Refuting alternative claims and Christian adoption. The assertion that biblical Israelites equate to modern Palestinians or that Jewish identity was hijacked by a foreign group lacks historical and textual credibility, yet the chosen people claim itself warrants critical scrutiny for its implications. The Israelites, defined by their covenant with God through Abraham around 2000 to 1800 BCE and Moses around 1526 to 1370 BCE, were a distinct ethnic and religious group in Canaan, as evidenced by the Merneptah stele from around 1200 BCE, which mentions Israel as a people in the region. This stele, erected by an Egyptian pharaoh, confirms the Israelites' presence as a Torah-observant, Hebrew-speaking group, distinct from surrounding Canaanite cultures. Modern Palestinians, whose identity emerged after the 7th century Islamic conquests, developed an Arab cultural and linguistic framework, rooted in the broader Arabization of the Levant, as documented in historical records from the Umayyad period. Genetic studies, including analyses of Y chromosome markers, confirm Jewish populations' Levantine origins, tracing continuity from Judah's tribe through the post-exilic period, as supported by textual records like the books of Chronicles. These findings refute claims of a hijacked Jewish identity, showing a consistent lineage despite exiles. Critics, however, argue that the chosen people concept, while historically grounded, promotes exclusivity, potentially justifying cultural separatism that distanced Jews from neighboring peoples. Christianity, emerging from Judaism around 4 BCE through Jesus, a Jew from the tribe of Judah, adapted the chosen people concept into a spiritual framework, redefining its exclusivity. Galatians 3 verses 28 to 29, written by Paul in the 1st century, positions Christians as Abraham's heirs through faith, not ethnicity, declaring that distinctions of Jew or Gentile are irrelevant in Christ. This theological shift extended the covenant to non-Jews, spreading through Roman infrastructure, including roads and ports, which facilitated Paul's missions to cities like Corinth and Rome by the 50 CE. The conversion of Emperor Constantine, influenced by his vision in 312 CE and formalized by the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, amplified Christianity's reach, embedding the covenantal idea into European religious consciousness. Critics question whether the Jewish claim to chosenness enabled Christianity's universalism by providing a theological foundation or served as a self-aggrandizing narrative that contrasts sharply with Christianity's inclusivity. The Jewish emphasis on ethnic and ritual exclusivity, as seen in Torah practices like circumcision, stands in tension with Christianity's open invitation to all nations, raising doubts about the original claim's divine basis. The Jewish role as covenant bearers undeniably influenced Christianity's development, providing a monotheistic framework and scriptural tradition that shaped Western religious thought. However, the adaptation of the chosen people concept by another faith invites skepticism about its divine authenticity. If the covenant was divinely ordained for Israel alone, why was it so readily universalized by Christianity? Critics argue that the Jewish claim, while rooted in texts like Deuteronomy, may reflect a cultural strategy to assert identity in a competitive ancient world, rather than a unique divine mandate. The resilience of Jewish identity, preserved through texts and rituals, contrasts with Christianity's expansion, which diluted the ethnic specificity of chosenness. This divergence suggests that the chosen people concept, while influential, may have been a human construct designed to maintain cohesion, not a supernatural truth. The interplay between Jewish exclusivity and Christian universalism underscores the need to critically examine the claim's broader implications, particularly its role in shaping religious identities across centuries. Conclusion: the Jewish claim to being the chosen people, rooted in Deuteronomy 7 verse 6, asserts a theological narrative of divine election, positioning the Israelites as uniquely favored by God. This claim, spanning a biblical timeline from Abraham's covenant around 2000 to 1800 BCE to Jesus' ministry around 4 BCE, establishes the Israelites, and later the Jews through Judah's lineage, as God's elect, tasked with upholding his law. However, its legitimacy invites critical scrutiny, as the concept's exclusivity raises questions about its divine authenticity versus its role as a cultural construct. The term, chosen people, evolving from patriarchal promises in Genesis to post-exilic reaffirmations in Ezra and Nehemiah, underscores a deliberate effort to preserve ethnic and religious identity through centuries of adversity. Critics argue this reflects strategic self-definition rather than divine mandate, as the Jews' survival, while remarkable, mirrors the resilience of other ancient cultures, challenging claims of unique supernatural favor. The biblical chronology traces this claim through key figures and events: Adam's creation around 3300 BC, Noah's survival of the flood around 2700 BC, Abraham's covenant, Jacob's 12 tribes, Moses' delivery of the Torah around 1526 to 1370 BCE, and the United Monarchy under David and Solomon around 1000 BC. The Assyrian conquest of 722 BCE and the Babylonian exile from 587 to 539 BC tested Jewish identity, yet Judah, Benjamin, and Levi preserved it through synagogue worship, Torah study, and rituals like Passover. Ezra's reforms around 458 BCE and the Maccabean revolt around 167 BCE further entrenched the chosen people concept, but critics contend these were responses to external threats, not divine interventions. The Jews' ability to maintain their identity, unlike vanished peoples like the Hittites, is impressive, yet comparable to the Persians' cultural continuity under similar pressures. Genetic studies confirming Jewish Levantine origins support historical continuity, but they do not validate divine selection, suggesting resilience was driven by human agency. The refutation of alternative claims, such as equating biblical Israelites with modern Palestinians or suggesting a hijacked Jewish identity, rests on robust evidence. The Merneptah stele from 1200 BCE and textual records like Chronicles confirm the Israelites' distinct identity, while Palestinian identity emerged post-7th century Islamic conquests. However, the chosen people concept's exclusivity raises concerns about its broader implications as it potentially fostered cultural separatism, distancing Jews from neighboring societies. Christianity's adoption of the covenant, beginning with Jesus, a Jew from Judah, and spreading through Paul's missions and Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 CE, highlights the Jewish claim's influence. Galatians 3 verses 28 to 29 reinterprets chosenness as spiritual, extending it to all believers, which contrasts with Jewish ethnic exclusivity. This universalization prompts skepticism. If the covenant was divinely ordained for Israel alone, why was it so readily adapted by another faith? The Jewish claim, while historically grounded in texts and archaeology, may have fostered division by emphasizing separation over integration, challenging its divine authenticity. Critics argue it served as a cultural mechanism to ensure survival in a hostile ancient world, not a supernatural truth. Nonetheless, the Jews' endurance as a people claiming divine chosenness reflects a complex interplay of faith, resilience, and strategic adaptation, profoundly shaping global religious history. The concept's influence on Christianity underscores its significance, yet its exclusivity invites ongoing critical examination. Was chosenness a divine mandate or a human narrative crafted to navigate existential threats? The Jews' survival, while extraordinary, parallels other resilient cultures, suggesting that their legacy, though impactful, may stem from human tenacity rather than divine election, warranting continued scrutiny of its theological and historical foundations.